Hello, you dirty potters! How are you today? In today's video, we're gonna go over some pro tips on how to make a proper, good, fitted lidded form. When you really think about it, a basic teapot is pretty much just a lidded form with a spout and a handle on it. After you know how to make a jar form, or at least a really good jar, you essentially learn how to make a spout, put a filter on it if you want to, and you put a handle on it. And you've probably already learned how to make a handle when you went through your cup phase. So in today's video, I'm gonna go over some of the tips and tricks that really helped me make sure my lidded forms are nice, tight, and fitted. Now before we start the video, I want to be clear about this. In this video, I am not teaching you how to make a jar or a lidded form. I've already made a video on that. It looks like this. I made it quite some time ago. I will link it down below if you're looking for a video on how to make a lidded jar or lidded form. This video is kind of like a pro tip slash masterclass on how to get those lids nice and tight and perfect if you already know how to make a jar, but you're having some trouble still. First, let's talk about the two types of lidded jars that you are most likely going to come in contact with. The first one is a lidded jar with a gallery. A gallery is essentially a little shelf on the upper end or inside of a pot in which the lid sits. Most of the time when throwing forms like this, we save a little bit of clay at the top so we can separate it at a later time, which makes the divot or the shelf, which is called the gallery, so that we can fit that lid that we make later on onto the lidded form itself. This type of lidded jar is pretty easy, especially if you know how to make plates already, because what you need to set on top of that shelf called the gallery is just a flat disc if you want to, and you can even sculpt your own handle. It's really easy. You just put a little plate, as it were, on top of that shelf. The second type of jar or lidded form that you'll come in contact with is the drop-in lidded form. The drop-in lidded form is easier in the throwing phase than it is in the lid making phase, but you still need to split clay down the middle somewhere. It's essentially a normal pot. The only difference is that you have the lid in which drops into the form itself to keep it nice and tight. No matter which one you make, you're essentially making two types of forms of split clay somewhere along the middle. You're essentially splitting the clay to make a gallery for one of the forms, or you're splitting the clay to make a lid later on when you're throwing the form. A little potter tip here: when I used to teach classes at another place, I would teach people how to make these forms and lidded jars, and afterwards they would say which one is easier. None of these two forms, in which are the most basic that you'll probably come in contact with, are easier than another. In order to make the gallery lid, you're essentially having to split clay at the very top while making the form itself. In order to make a drop-in lid, you're also splitting clay. You're just doing it when you're making the form of the lid itself. Either way, you're going to have to learn how to split clay, unless you're doing a different type of jar or lidded form. I only mention this for you because the skill is essentially the same. It's transferable. One is not easier than the other. They're basically the same because it takes the same skill set to do both of them. Pro tip number one: it is very common for potters to throw their lids off of the hump. This is for a couple of reasons. One mainly is because you can always leave a little bit of extra clay at the very bottom of your lid when you take it off, and trim this later on to be the handle, instead of sculpting a handle yourself and trying to score it, slip it, and attach it, and hoping it sticks with no cracks. This is something that I personally do in my own work. I almost always throw my stuff off the hump, and even when I'm not throwing it off the hump, I always use a little bit of extra clay, because if you don't know how to throw off the hump, you can still leave excess clay down there to turn it upside down at a later time and trim it so that you can trim a handle into the form instead of dealing with it some other way. This way you essentially erase an entire step of having to make the handle, unless you're making something that doesn't open. And even then, that step's not necessary, because if you never want the jar to open, you could just glaze it shut. Pro tip number two: when making a lidded form, the lid specifically, it is almost always better to use a little bit more clay and make the lid a little larger than it is to make it smaller. Here's what usually happens to most of us. The high majority of us either use rulers, calipers, a lid master, some type of tool to measure and keep track of what we need to fit into our lids or our gallery jars. This is very common, whether you write it down and you're measuring it by inches all the way across, or if you're just making the lid and kind of trusting yourself. There's some form of measurement going on in your mind. In this case, it's almost always better to make it a little bit bigger. If you think that you need a lid that is 4.5 from the end of the circle to the end of the circle, why not make it 4.6, maybe even 4.7 inches? The reason behind this is because it's really easy to mitigate this, as in the leather stages, you can simply put this back on the wheel and trim a little bit more, refitting the lid as it comes off the wheel as you keep on trimming it. And trust me, this is much easier than it is to add on clay or make a new lid. Most of the time, I can just trim down my lid and it'll fit sooner or later if it's too big. If it's too small, I either have to make a new lid or I need to attach clay, in which case, I'm gonna have to trim the edges anyway, because I'm not that great at attaching clay around a circle, and so I'm gonna have to trim it to make it a perfect circle in order to fit. It's almost always better to just make it a tad bit bigger if you are unsure. This happens to almost all of us. At some point when you're learning how to make lidded jars, you're going to make one that's too small or too big. If you make it too small, you're kind of done with it. If you make it too big, you can just trim a little bit. It's an easy fix. Tip number 3 is truly a huge one. It's saved many, many lids, and it got me over my hump for my skill check to learn how to make good lidded jars. This was actually my problem. I'm someone who likes to make drop-in lids. Because of this, the way I make them is I throw off the hump. I usually make what you would consider either a small bowl or a plate. I split the clay at a very thick part by pushing one part down, leaving a positive for the other part. And this is usually how I make my drop-in lids. A big problem with people who make drop-in lids, including myself, is that if you do not make them correct or exactly 90 degrees straight up and down, you usually leave some type of small little slope at the bottom of where that positive starts. This means that later on, when you end up putting the lid on, it's not going to fit because you might have measured the end of that drop-in instead of the beginning where the slope starts, or at least where the positive starts. And I know this is a bit difficult to understand because this didn't make any sense to me either. I thought I measured it, it's fine, it should fit, and when I went to put it on, it did not fit. What I didn't know is that I wasn't making the drop-in portion completely straight. You can do this by either taking a straight edge, either a ruler, a potter's wooden knife. I like to do it with my metal rib. You can do it with a wooden rib, any straight edge, and you need to make that drop-in portion, especially the positive part, completely straight and clean at the bottom. Once I realized this, I essentially had to turn all my lids upside down and trim them to make them an exactly straight drop-in. And I know for a lot of you this might be common sense, but for me this was a game changer. I was like, oh, that's why all my drop-ins aren't fitting. That makes total sense. And this was one of 2 problems. The second one is that sometimes the inner curve of my drop-in where that positive starts to slope we talked about earlier, that would be a little bit unclean. So sometimes clay would be down there because I didn't brush off or sponge off that part, and little clumps of clay down there would make the lid sit a little unevenly. Knowing how to take care of these 2 things, especially for just a drop-in lid, is magical. And all you really have to do is take some type of straight edge. I usually use my rib or I use a wooden potter's knife and stick it down there at the very bottom of the positive. As soon as you're done throwing your lid, remeasure it to make sure, and then it should fit perfectly. But this is what happens when you have a slope on a drop-in lid that doesn't fit perfectly. It sits up a little higher than usual and it never truly drops down or drops into the form itself, making a very poor fitting form. I'm so angry I used to make jars like this. By the same token, if you have any clay left down there by that slope we talked about earlier, this portion right here, you will end up having a wonky fitting lid. A lot of times I'll check for some of my students' lids actually meet the form itself, and you find a giant lump of clay down there while they're complaining their lid isn't sitting plumb or exactly on the level. This is mainly because you just didn't wipe off your stuff while you're throwing that form. I know that's a very small thing, and the slope thing I mentioned matters way more, but there's someone out there who's not cleaning the bottoms of their edges and the attachment points of where their lid meets the piece itself when it kind of drops in. Right here, it's kind of dirty right here, and we just saved a lot of their work. Pro tip number 4, and this is kind of just a treat for the average potter who makes lidded forms. If your lidded form fits perfectly and you use something like a Giffen grip, or you throw pots on bats like I do sometimes, you don't technically have to put the lid on the wheel and then trim them, even if you're trimming a lid into them. If your lid fits perfectly onto your form, you can very easily put the pot on the wheel, center it, whether you're using regular centered clay with 3 little pieces of clay, a Giffen grip, or if you're using some type of bat, you can just put the lid on top of it and it fits perfectly. If you've done a great job, it sits so well that you can just trim it directly on the pot. This is really satisfying for potters who make jars like this because it tells you that you did a good job and that the lidded form fits very well. So well that the lid doesn't move, and so you can trim it while it's directly centered on the pot itself in the trimming phase. A little potter tip here for those of you who are still on your ceramic art journey. Every clay has a different shrinkage and drying rate. For example, the amount that bean mixed with grog shrinks is completely different from the amount that porcelain shrinks, especially when it's gone all the way through the glaze cycle, from the greenware to the bisque to the fully fired glaze. Because of this, they shrink different amounts. This means that it's not really a good idea to take different clay bodies and make lids out of them, no matter how well you measure. So anywhere from the greenware phase all the way down to the fully fired, glazed phase, they can shrink at different times and different rates. This means that you really shouldn't be making, let's say, a red stone jar with a porcelain lid and trying to fit the two on there unless you're real good at math. This is also pretty worrisome because you don't want to make a lidded form one day, wait for it to dry all the way to the bone dry phase, and then try and fit the lid on in the trim phase because you made the lid a different day. These aren't really wise things. So if you make a lidded form, it's best that you make it out of, number one, the same clay body, and number two, around the same time. The last and final pro tip I have to give you about lidded jar forms is after all of that, after you followed the rules, you measured everything, you made sure that the slope isn't there when you're making a drop-in lid, the gallery is perfect, you smoothed out all your clay. Sometimes things still don't end up exactly how you want them to. Sometimes you get a little glop of glaze on the side and it makes it just so that the lid barely doesn't fit. Luckily, you can really easily buy some grinding compound either off of Schmamazon, or you can get it from Home Depot or Lowe's or wherever you find grinding compound. Put it on your lid and just grind those two edges together, both the lid and the portion where it attaches to the jar itself. And usually, you end up grinding it down to a perfect fit. Not only that, it ends up pretty smooth. At least 1 out of every 5 jars I make have some type of defect like this, where the glaze ran a little bit too much and made a type of glop at the bottom of my lid, because you're not supposed to glaze your lids and the attachment points anyway, but sometimes they run. And so I knock it off and I end up grinding it, and then it fits perfectly. Well, thank you, Dirty Potters, for joining me today. I hope that some of these tips have helped you. I know that just one of those tips would have helped me a lot when I was first starting to make lidded jars and lidded forms, and they made my teapots even all the better. Especially tip number 3. I truly did not understand for years that this little slope right here, when I'm throwing off of the hump for a drop-in lid, made a lot of my lidded jars not fit. They just kind of sat on top like this instead of fitting snugly in this fashion. And it really didn't matter how much I measured either, because once I had the slope there, I wasn't even measuring the slope. I was measuring the top of the positive instead of the bottom of the positive where I was putting the slope. Well, thank you, Dirty Potters, for joining me today. Hopefully you like these more pro videos. I'm trying to do a lot more definition videos and pro videos because I feel like a lot of you who watch my beginner videos might need something else to really perfect your forms, and I hope these tips really reach your work. Remember to click all those like buttons, or else Amico is going to come in the middle of the night and lid me. They're going to lid me real good.
Thank you for your patronage.
God, as soon as I have to record in this uninsulated garage in the middle of summer in California, I just turn into an old Southern lady. I just have a towel in my hand, and I'm like, oh my God, oh. I turn to every dad ever. Oh, it's a scorcher out there today. Oh, keep cool, kids. Oh.